Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Schill, and I'm president of the University of Oregon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's combined Derrick Bell Lecture and African American Workshop and Lecture Series featuring Professor LIa Epperson. I'm looking forward to today's discussion, and I want to thank Professor Epperson for joining us today. I'd also like to thank Marcelin Burke, the Dean of the University of Oregon School of Law, and Yvette Alex-Asenso, University of Oregon's Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, for their leadership in planning tonight's event. Today's lecture is an important part of the university's mission. Bringing people together from a variety of perspectives, backgrounds, and beliefs, albeit over Zoom, is not only a learning opportunity for our students, but it also allows our whole university community to consider how we can continue the work of building a more inclusive and equitable society. The African American Workshop and Lecture Series was started as part of our commitment to bringing experts to campus to explore issues around race, equity, inclusion, diversity, and the African American experience. The vision for the series goes hand in hand with that of the law school's Derrick Bell Lecture. That lecture, which was named after the first African American dean of the University of Oregon School of Law, it honors Derrick Bell's legacy of integrity and unwavering commitment to inclusion. To truly prepare our students for success in their studies after graduation, events like this are necessary for helping us better understand each other and for fostering a campus environment that's welcoming to all. So now I'd like to welcome and introduce Dean Burke, the David Frohmeyer Chair in Leadership and Law, who will introduce today's speaker. Dean Burke.
Good afternoon, and thank you so very much for joining us today for the 2021 Derrick Bell Lecture. And thank you to Michael Schill and Yvette Alex-Asenso for their leadership and partnering with the law school to bring you this lecture. While the format is new this year, our purpose certainly is not. Given all that has transpired in the last year, our reason for gathering has heightened significance. We hold this annual lecture to honor Derrick Bell, as President Schill said, was the first Black dean of the University of Oregon School of Law. He was one of the first people of color also to serve as the law dean at a non-historically Black college or university. Some of you and many of our students may have thought that I was the first Black dean at Oregon Law. I am not. I am the first Black woman law dean here to lead the law school, and I am standing on the shoulders of Dean Derrick Bell. In this brief time that I have to introduce today's lecture, it's going to be difficult to convey the significance of Derrick Bell's lecture, but I will give it a try. He was a professor, a legal scholar, and a dean who forever changed the American legal scholarship, and the legal academy. His professional career began with his acceptance of a job at the U.S. Department of Justice. He then left this position when he was asked to resign membership in the NAACP. Soon thereafter, he went to work for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where he was one of 5 attorneys, along with Thurgood Marshall. Bell's decision to leave the Justice Department would be one of many professional decisions that he made on the basis of conscience. In 1967, Derrick Bell began his career in academia, which would include work as a legal scholar, professor, and administrator. In addition to being at the University of Oregon, this journey took him to Harvard and NYU. Dean Bell is recognized as one of the founders of critical race theory, and he often wrote about structural racism, racism that has been at the forefront of our national conversation this past year, racism which still persists. Many of us in the academy, as well as lawyers, have our own stories to tell about the impact of Derrick Bell's work on our lives. For example, when I was in law school, I was a teaching assistant for an undergraduate class, Race in the Law, and we used Derrick Bell's casebook. And while I never was fortunate enough to meet Derrick Bell while he was living, his legacy helps drive and motivate my work every day. On the other hand, our speaker today does have some personal experience with Derrick Bell. Our speaker today is Professor LIa Epperson. And the title of her talk is Are We Still Not Saved? Race, Democracy, and Educational Inequality, which is a reference to one of Dean Bell's books. In 1987, he published And We Are Not Saved, The Elusive Quest for Racial Justice. And that title itself alludes back to the words of the Old Testament of the Bible, when prophet Jeremiah wept for his people. The book pushes the readers, Dean Bell's book, pushes the reader to reconsider our history as we envision a transformed country that is free of racism and provides for equal opportunity. Dean Bell's challenge to us over 3 decades ago seems very much like the call for our current times. With this challenge from the past and our common future ahead of us, we are so delighted to welcome Professor Epperson to help us explore a key issue in forging a more equal and just country, educational inequality. That is her topic today. Before she worked in academia, Professor Epperson served as the Director of Education, Litigation, and Policy at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and also as a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Professor Epperson's research focuses on the role of public schools, colleges, and universities in creating equal opportunity. She shared her expertise with the University of Oregon as our 2015 speaker at our O'Connell conference. And we are so pleased to be able to welcome her here again as we grapple with these issues that are critical to the future of our democracy and critical to the future of our country. Before Professor Epperson speaks, I'd like to make a few special welcomes. First, we're delighted to have Dr. Janet Bell, who is Dean Bell's widow, joining us today. Also joining us is Dean Bell's son, Derrick Bell III. And finally, I'd like to welcome Anita Johnson, one of the owners of Eugene Weekly, who has been a supporter of this lecture from its inception. Again, thank you to President Schill for his commitment to equity and inclusion and his support of this lecture and the African American Workshop and Lecture Series. We also appreciate the partnership that we formed with the UO Division of Equity and Inclusion for this lecture under the leadership of Dr. Alex Asenso. And finally, I'd like to thank Jennifer Geller at the law school, who leads our efforts. So now will you please join me in a virtual applause to welcome Professor LIa Epperson to the podium, our 2021 Derrick Bell Lecturer.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for that warm welcome, Dean Burke. It is really my honor to be able to join you virtually for the Derrick Bell Lecture. I'm really delighted to be able to be with University of Oregon folks again these many years later. I'm very grateful to the university, to President Schill, to the Vice President of Equity, and to the organizers of the workshop series and the lecture. I'm also delighted to be able to be here virtually with Dr. Janet Bell and with Derrick Bell III. So thank you so much for having me. And hopefully all is well with the PowerPoint that I will be sharing, and that everyone can see that well. So the title, as Dean Burke said, of my talk is, Are We Still Not Saved? Race, Democracy, and Educational Inequality. 34 years ago, in his seminal book, And We Are Not Saved, The Elusive Quest for Racial Justice, Derrick Bell provided a critical view of American history and constitutional jurisprudence to illustrate the challenges the United States faces in reaching true equality. In his enlightened observations about the structure of our republic, Bell refers to the American contradiction. To see true progress toward meaningful equality, he contends, we must reckon with the challenging truth of our history, that we are a nation founded on this constitutional contradiction. He says, the contradiction sacrificed the rights of some in the belief that this involuntary forfeiture was necessary to secure the rights of others, in a society espousing as its basic principle the liberty of all. The Constitution, while claiming to speak in an unequivocal voice, in fact promises freedom to whites and condemned Blacks to slavery. In his work, Dean Bell argued that this American contradiction, shrouded by myth, serves as a perpetual impediment to addressing historic and persistent forms of racial injustice. This, he says, is the root reason for the inability of Black people to gain legitimacy. This reality of racial inequality is part of our culture and common history. It is the contradiction embedded in the ideology that formed our republic. In a series of parables in the book, Dean Bell outlines some of the most significant challenges in using the law as a tool for social change. And as Dean Burke mentioned, his book title references Jeremiah, the Old Testament prophet, who predicted the fall of Jerusalem and the captivity of Jews in Babylon. The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. Bell posited that 3 decades after the Supreme Court broke the back of legal apartheid in Brown versus Board of Education, after the Civil Rights Movement, the activism and deaths of great leaders, the passage of key civil rights legislation, there was no permanent harvest of racial equality. And yet, Bell's work also highlights the limited role that some governmental strategies may play in offering pathways to stem the systemic inequities born of this American contradiction. As a child growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I learned of the work of the trailblazing defenders of the Constitution, like NAACP Legal Defense Fund lawyer turned Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. I also learned of Professor Derrick Bell, a Pittsburgh native and former Legal Defense Fund lawyer who grew up with my mother and her family in a segregated neighborhood in Pittsburgh called the Hill District. And you can see Dean Bell in this picture. I think he looks exactly as he does in the pictures in his adulthood, standing behind my aunt in this picture from junior high school in 1945. As a young lawyer with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I believed deeply in the work of these defenders of the Constitution. And as a constitutional law professor, I continue to believe in the meaningful role that each of us plays in making real the promise of democracy and equality set forth in the words of our founding document. Throughout his life's work, Dean Bell challenged us to unmask the more difficult parts of our history, our Constitution, and to better understand these pieces and how they fit into present circumstances. He used history to craft parables, and these parables served as forewarnings of future crises if we did not heed their lessons. In this profoundly disconcerting time in our nation's history, the work of Dean Derrick Bell seems deeply prophetic. We hear the constant refrain, we are living in extraordinary times, through the devastation of the global health pandemic known as COVID-19, the summer of racial reckoning with the murder of George Floyd and the global protests for Black lives. The constitutional crisis brought by the deadly insurrection at the United States Capitol, where domestic terrorists constructed gallows on the Capitol steps and brandished Confederate flags through its halls. The extraordinary, however, is in many ways an entirely foreseeable experience when viewed in light of our republic's history and constitutional jurisprudence. As William Faulkner once wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." It is perhaps because of our failure to reckon with our history that we are here in this profoundly disconcerting time, and why if Dean Bell were here, he would certainly say, "Still, we are not saved." We must learn the importance of understanding our past so we can learn to choose a different future. Perhaps ironically, one can see the most profound and meaningful lessons in the education domain and in the experiences of our country's most vulnerable students. The events of the last year, including the catastrophic health crisis, racial violence, and the ensuing physical, psychological, and economic trauma, have wreaked havoc on an education system already suffering deeply from widespread inequity. In schools, children learn basic skills such as reading, writing, arithmetic, but they also learn other life skills. As Thurgood Marshall argued in the Little Rock, Arkansas school desegregation case, Cooper versus Aaron, education is the teaching of overall citizenship, to learn to live together as citizens, and above all, to obey the law. Schools are the incubators for the next generation of knowledgeable citizens who will become actively engaged in the continual building and strengthening of our republic. For the most vulnerable students in our public schools, historic and persistent racial and economic segregation greatly shapes their access to quality education. In addition, their experiences are further shaped by differing public investments in and student access to educational opportunities, and experiences with racial violence and trauma that have plagued our republic both in and out of education spaces. And the onslaught of COVID both illuminates and exacerbates these entrenched educational inequalities. At this moment, however, we are at an inflection point. The pandemic of COVID-19 exacerbates educational inequality, but it also provides an opportunity for a long overdue reckoning with the more troubling parts of our shared history and their indelible mark on access to education in the United States. We have a collective responsibility to create structural solutions better educating children for full and robust participation in our society. But to do so, we must first examine the recent history of access to educational opportunity to understand how the pandemics of COVID-19 and racial violence shape this landscape. So I would like to paint a picture for you, the landscape of existing educational inequality and how COVID lays this bare. It may be challenging, but it is necessary to understand how the American contradiction leaves an indelible mark on our institutions of learning. And in doing so, through mobilizing our history and engaging legal institutions, perhaps we may forge paths to address these pandemics in education with pragmatism, with hope, and ultimately strengthen our republic. Therefore, I'd like to proceed in 4 parts. In part 1, I will paint a picture of the state of schools today. In many ways, one could call this the first pandemic in education, the pandemic of racial and economic inequality in education and its effect on the life opportunities for students of color. In part 2, I will examine the role of racial violence and trauma and its effect on the opportunities for education. In part 3, I will discuss the ways in which the global health pandemic of COVID-19 has both illuminated and exacerbated the existing racial and economic fissures in American education. These pandemics have ongoing effects on students, on the communities in which they live, and on their futures. Ultimately, in part 4, I will discuss how, in exposing the landscape of pandemic education and its antecedents, we are at a crossroads. While daunting, it can be hopeful in that it allows for a true reckoning with the American contradiction Dean Bell named. In this moment, this contradiction, by limiting educational and life opportunities, harms all children. It weakens our society. Hopefully, the reckoning forces a reimagination of structural solutions that help all children. So, what do schools look like today? Well, in 2021, our nation's public schools reflect a truly multiracial America. There is no majority racial group enrolled in United States public schools. While white students still comprise the largest racial group of students in the country, the enormous rise in the nation's Latinx population means that more than 50% of the nation's students of color, 13 million, identify as Latinx. Black students account for more than 7 million of the students of color, followed by Asian, multiracial, and Native American students. By any measure, however, educational opportunity in the United States has a long history rooted in racial and socioeconomic inequality, whose branches support today's racially and economically inequitable education systems. Although it's been more than 6 decades since the United States Supreme Court outlawed state-mandated apartheid in public education in Brown v. Board of Education, subsequent Supreme Court decisions ensured such a slow trajectory for school desegregation that schools in the Deep South remained segregated nearly a decade after the decision. Moreover, long-standing and intractable residential segregation in the United States played an equally pernicious role in the perpetuation of racial inequality in access to schools. Policies and practices designed to perpetuate housing segregation enabled similar trends in schooling patterns across the United States. And then Supreme Court and lower court decisions ensured patterns of neighborhood and school segregation throughout much of the North, the West, and Southwestern parts of the country, despite a growing multicultural population. Consider Gadsden, Alabama, for example, a small Southern town that was under a desegregation decree until the year 2000, one of the cases I litigated at the Legal Defense Fund. The schools there were quite slow to desegregate. After the Brown decision, the school district renamed a middle school after the first imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, General Nathan Bedford Forrest. When a district court judge declared the school district unitary in 2000, he noted that the level of interracial cooperation in Gadsden was favorable when compared with factions in Kosovo and Northern Ireland. Ultimately, he noted the school board cannot require the lion to lay down with the lamb. Due to slow-moving and ineffectual desegregation policies, as well as these deeply rooted housing segregation policies, today, public schools in the United States remain intensely segregated by both race and class. In fact, a typical student in the United States attends school where the largest group of fellow classmates are of the same race as the student. This racial segregation often overlaps with economic segregation in elementary and secondary schools as well. So Black students, for whom segregation is increasing in all parts of the United States, also on average attend schools with much more poverty than their white peers. And this is also true of Latinx students. This is called a double segregation by race and by class, and it has long-term educational and opportunity costs for students in these segregated schools. It affects their student achievement, college access and success, as well as long-term employment, income, and health indicators. These sobering statistics are, in fact, the legacy of the American contradiction Dean Bell identified, and our refusal to acknowledge the continued effects on systems of education. As Justice Marshall opined in his dissenting opinion in the Detroit school case, Milliken versus Bradley, desegregation is not and was never expected to be an easy task. Racial attitudes ingrained in our nation's childhood and adolescence are not quickly thrown aside in its middle years. And yet, despite such setbacks, there are opportunities for hope. If one is conscious of these patterns of segregation and inequity, carefully structured policies and programs may help to alleviate them. For example, by leveraging changing demographic patterns and the expansion of school choice. In instances where communities and school districts have faced the persistent effects of historic segregation, there are possibilities and successes in addressing these challenges. So what about racial violence and police in schools and the reckoning of 2020? Well, in addition to existing racial and economic segregation in public schools, there are myriad existing inequities in programs and policies that affect life opportunities for students. And one of the starkest examples is the discriminatory use of school discipline policies. While we no longer have policies that sanction racial segregation legally, as in the days before Brown, there are Black and Brown students across the country who are disproportionately the targets of discriminatory behavior and draconian discipline measures. In the United States, the majority of Black and Latinx students comprise the majority of students who receive excessive disciplinary exclusion or are pushed out of our nation's schools. Black students are more than 3.5 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than their classmates. Latinx students are 1.5 times more likely to be suspended when compared to white students. And studies overwhelmingly make clear, however, that Black and Brown students are no more likely to commit offenses worthy of such punishment than white students. Just last year, in Orlando, Florida, for example, Black first grader Kaya Roll entered school eager to learn, but she suffered from a lack of sleep due to a health condition. She lost her temper and she lashed out at the adults at the school. Although she calmed down shortly thereafter, 2 police officers entered her classroom and placed zip-tie cuffs around her wrists. Despite Kaya's pleas to, "Please give me a second chance," they took her to the County Juvenile Assessment Center. Again, she was a first grader, 6 years old. With the rising number of police officers stationed in public schools, these racial disparities in school discipline grow in severity and in gravity. In 2015, the United States Department of Justice estimated there were approximately 19,000 police officers stationed in schools throughout the United States. Such use of police officers in schools is more common at those schools where the majority of students are Black. Student behavior that previously warranted a visit to the principal may now result in arrest or referral to the juvenile justice system. Such harsh school punishments disproportionately impact students of color. For example, according to the US Department of Education, Black and Latinx students comprised more than 70% of student arrests or referrals to the juvenile justice system in the 2009-2010 school year. Meanwhile, Black middle and high school students are more likely to attend a school that has more security staff than mental health providers. And for those Black and Brown students who have received harsh disciplinary measures, there are long-term consequences. A student who is suspended or expelled is more than twice as likely to be arrested within the same month as one who has no prior suspension in that month. Juvenile incarceration impedes educational and life opportunities, including high school graduation rates, future likelihood of incarceration, physical and mental health, employment, housing, and higher education opportunities. The reality is that for generations, Black children have learned challenging lessons on democracy and state-sanctioned violence at the doors of the schoolhouse. There's a thread from lessons like the bayonet-wielding soldiers of the Arkansas National Guard who blocked Black students' entry to white schools in the wake of the Brown decision, like in these photographs of Little Rock Central High, to the countless Black students experiencing school violence today, like Kaya being escorted from her first grade classroom in handcuffs. Yet, there have been examples of paths for change. In 2014, the US Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights issued guidance on school discipline to help school districts assess the significant racial disparities and address them. The guidance detailed best practices for schools to meet legal obligations under federal civil rights laws and ensure non-discriminatory discipline measures. Now, in 2018, the Department of Education rescinded this guidance. That was a difficult era because without explicit acknowledgement of and attention to these disparities, the practices can continue. But I do believe it is likely to reinstate guidance like this and to expand upon it. So when you think of the hope for the American contradiction that we see in this disproportionate use of police force against Black and brown children in schools, the hope lies in the truth telling. The Office for Civil Rights assisted tremendously when they cataloged the information to shed light on the truth of the school to prison pipeline and its harms on more vulnerable students. Armed with this information, it becomes easier to develop and implement policies to address it. And with the advent of social media, there's a growing societal awareness of these harms. In fact, one need only look to this past year, the extraordinary times of 2020. The summer of 2020 was a watershed moment in the exposure of a culture of racially disparate uses of force by police in the United States. With the advent of smartphone cameras and social media campaigns, horrific examples of this violence landed in the news feeds of individuals of all races, creeds, colors, and economic backgrounds across the United States and around the world. Throughout American history, there have been countless examples of the killing of unarmed Black women and men by law enforcement in the United States. Yet the most widely reported example this summer is the death of George Floyd, an unarmed Black man killed by Minnesota police officers who placed a knee on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. Officers attempted to arrest Floyd for allegedly passing a counterfeit bill. And this prompted the largest national and international protest movement in recent history. And when I reference this, I am referencing those who are engaged in nonviolent protests because these were plentiful. While the loudest directives for massive structural and legal change in the movement for Black lives center on dismantling mass incarceration and its attendant racial disparities in criminal justice, often called the new Jim Crow, education is equally vital as a domain for reform because it has critical implications for legal institutions. The heightened exposure of racially disparate use of force by police has renewed calls for an anti-racist movement in education. And this is an area with the greatest potential for positive transformation. Well, this takes us to part 3, pandemic education and COVID-19 as an inequality amplifier. In the past year, the global pandemic known as COVID-19 wreaked havoc on every aspect of American life. While the virus first came to the United States in January of 2020, it spread with such alarming force that the United States Department of Health and Human Services declared a public health emergency, with quarantine orders introduced for international travelers and in many states, and most school districts began to close in March to ensure that students wouldn't infect one another. By the end of the school year in June of 2020, the United States had the highest number of cases and deaths due to COVID-19 of any country in the world. At the start of the new school year, countless schools across the country remained closed for in-person learning. Well, who does this deadly virus harm exactly? In the United States, as the pandemic continues, the reality of the virus illuminates and exacerbates these existing inequalities in several ways. It is not an equal opportunity virus. There are significant and alarming racial disparities with respect to which communities suffer most from COVID-related illness and death. The devastating effects are particularly apparent among Black and Latinx communities. Rather than serving as the great equalizer, the viral pandemic amplifies inequality. And the evidence reveals that confirmed cases of COVID-19 and confirmed deaths have been disproportionately higher in communities with larger Black populations, with Blacks affected at a rate 3 times higher than whites. In fact, early studies found that twice as many people of color under the age of 65 suffer COVID-related deaths compared to whites. And the contributing factors echo those discussed above that impact Black and Latinx communities, like higher rates of poverty, higher incidences of overcrowding in neighborhoods, poor air quality, lack of access to healthcare. And for children in the United States, these disparities in COVID-related deaths are even more alarming. So although they comprise only 41% of the United States population, the Centers for Disease Control reported that more than 75% of those killed by COVID-19 are Hispanic, Black, and American Indian, Alaskan Native children. And again, the root causes of the racial disparity in child deaths from COVID stem from these environmental factors linked to broader and deeply embedded ongoing racial disparities, now more commonly referred to as structural racism, like food insecurity, housing insecurity, overcrowding in neighborhoods, differential access to healthcare due to issues like childcare, lack of insurance, transportation, or lack of access to sick leave. In addition, the deleterious economic effects of this pandemic have disproportionate effects on communities. So in recent surveys, more than half of Latinx and nearly half of Black respondents reported experiencing economic hardships due to the pandemic. They are also communities that are at a higher risk of mental health concerns due to the pandemic. Again, this evidence links directly back to policies and practices that have historically discriminated against communities of color, and we continue to feel these effects deeply today. So what does this look like for education? What is the effect on the education landscape? Well, it's clear that all students have suffered under the pandemic, but there are some groups who have been especially vulnerable. These include the 7 million children with disabilities, children with immigrant parents, children of color, children in poverty. As schools struggle to educate students amidst the rising death toll in the United States, the impact of this virus sheds a harsh light on inequality in education. And so as most schools close their doors and move to remote learning models, the most economically vulnerable student populations have lacked clear access to education. Indeed, some students lacked any access to education in the early weeks of school closures, as nearly 50% of American school children live in states that did not require distance learning. And for those that mandated remote learning, many students were indeed left behind. Early evidence suggests that online education in its current iteration in American schools has a devastating impact on low-income Black and Latinx students, populations that often overlap. In Salinas, California, for example, you may have seen the pictures that went viral of the Garcia sisters, who sat outside a local Taco Bell to gain internet access for schoolwork, as they had no home access to the internet. And they are not alone. Low-income families are less likely to have access to the internet and to have home computers. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, more than 9 million children lack access to the internet through a home computer. Some studies suggest as many as 12 million students lack access to the internet at home, and this leaves them adrift in a sea of remote learning. This is often called the homework gap. This gap where approximately 17% of students in this country lack access to computers at home. 18% lack access to broadband internet. And this homework gap reflects larger educational barriers for Black and Latinx students and for poor students, as these are the students most likely to be without home computers and internet access. And interestingly, while income differences account for a portion of the racial divide in digital access, the divide remains even after accounting for income differences. And Black and Latinx school children are those who are disproportionately more likely to suffer consequences due to school closures, such as food insecurity and transportation issues. Almost 85% of low-income households with children who qualify for free or reduced price meals have been without those meals during COVID school closures. And research shows that the children in the highest poverty school districts and students of color are those who are most likely to start the year in remote learning. So this transition to remote learning due to the COVID-19 pandemic will have lifelong effects for all students, but especially for Black and Latinx students most affected. In addition to these higher cases and deaths due to COVID-19, These populations are more likely to suffer greater learning losses and higher school dropout rates as months of remote learning continue. Together with the economic recession brought on by the pandemic, any of the state budgetary cuts to elementary and secondary education are more likely to affect these schools with higher Black and Latinx populations. And in fact, early studies suggest significant long-term economic devastation that may result from these educational hardships, both at the individual level and at the societal level. A McKinsey study, for example, estimates a loss of $110 billion in annual earnings for students in K-12 schools, with Black and Latinx students suffering significantly higher earnings losses than white students. But for the nation, the consequences are great. The study estimates a GDP loss of $173 billion to $271 billion per year. And as I discussed earlier, greater educational attainment translates into a host of positives for the nation. It's reducing crime, it's reducing incarceration, increasing civic and political participation, better health outcomes. So the coronavirus lays bare and amplifies inequalities that existed in the education landscape long before the cataclysmic health crisis. Indeed, both the coronavirus and the national protests over race and policing make it much more difficult to ignore these intractable educational inequities. And ultimately, I think this inability to ignore is a very good thing. So how do we take a nation where structural racism remains such a perniciously destructive force in systems of education, where it affects who suffers most from a deadly virus? How do we find avenues to strengthen our fragile republic? While the landscape is admittedly bleak, the domain of education also provides the greatest opportunity for transformative change. And so in the midst of the devastation of the COVID pandemic, I remain heartened by a number of countervailing factors. Despite the grim realities of these injustices I've just described, the COVID-19 pandemic shed a new light on this broken education system, and it provides an exceptional chance for reimagining education. It converges with a growing societal awareness of and movement to address intractable racial inequality. And we see this by the recent mass protests against racism around the globe. In addition, there's been considerable widespread movement to really examine the ways in which our systems of education and common culture have failed to wrestle with this American contradiction Dean Bell named. And so as our leaders and our teachers, our policymakers, and even our jurists begin to read and understand, this knowledge can inform better policies to unify all those who are affected. After all, I think of education as being the antidote. It's the antidote to the long-term effects of the American contradiction, and it affects all other aspects of societal opportunities. It's not an easy task to do this. We are at a unique time when the constitutional contradiction is blatantly exposed. The devastation in American education is a direct result of this contradiction and our failure to grapple with the most difficult parts of American history that continue to affect our republic and our democratic institutions. But the coronavirus pandemic and the racial protests of the summer provide a measure of tentative hope precisely because they make the American contradiction so difficult to ignore. I mean, when McKinsey forecasts a GDP loss of $271 billion due to pandemic education, we are all affected. The cataclysmic events force the question, how do we take this moment to strengthen our democracy, our republic, our future? And the path forward does not require unanimity, but it does require enough of us to see this harm and damage. And so I see hope in two ways. First, as Derrick Bell said, this moment of racial reckoning removes the myth of equality at the founding of our Constitution. By telling the truth about the pernicious and structural effects of racial inequality and its attendant evils in education, you can find healing and salvation. As the visionary writer and activist James Baldwin said, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. Here, now, we are unmasking the myth of historic equality in terrible ways. We've laid bare the pernicious racial inequality behind the murder of George Floyd. We are acknowledging where democracy has failed. And in doing so, we have a unique opportunity to educate the body politic in ways to correct it, with eyes open and information that helps us identify what we see. And we see this with the groundswell of interest in the movement for Black lives and in anti-racist education. Education, particularly understanding our shared history, plays a significant part in dismantling the structures of inequality and fostering opportunities for all children. So by courageously facing these terrible aspects of American history, we help to ensure that we do not repeat them. We strengthen our institutions of learning and opportunities for children by acknowledging them. And in doing so, creating a future with wider possibility. Secondly, the coronavirus pandemic casts a spotlight on the ways education is deeply failing the nation's most vulnerable children, which in turn affects all of our children. And armed with this information, local, state, and national policies can address persistent issues in transformative ways. So there is this unique opportunity to reimagine a more equitable public school system that addresses the needs of these most vulnerable student population. And this is not only students of color, it's again, poor students, students with special needs, students who are immigrants or children of immigrants. And in naming the injustices that they face, there are possibilities at every level of government to transform educational structures in ways that foster holistic learning and in ways that increase life opportunities. So while it is true that the United States Constitution does not include explicitly a positive right to education, nor has it been recognized as a fundamental right by the United States Supreme Court, we are at a unique moment in which opportunities for federal, legislative, and executive structural reforms in education may elicit long-term positive change. And in previous work, I've discussed the long history of federal legislative and executive involvement in education and the capacity for our political branches to maximize the successes of local innovations. With this unshakable spotlight on the need for answers to widening educational disparities, the time may be ripe for greater attention to a form of cooperative federalism, in which federal and state governments can collaboratively address the persistent disparities. We have long-standing legislation, such as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was reauthorized as No Child Left Behind, and then in 2015, reauthorized as the Every Student Succeeds Act, but that may provide accessible ways to ensure more national attention to minimal standards of education. And this, coupled with existing federal legislation focusing on the needs of particularly vulnerable students, can help. In addition, our executive branch has broad capacity to and experience in interpreting and enforcing equality through provisions of the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Educational Opportunities Act, and the Individual with Disabilities in Education Act. Broadly speaking, governmental policy, funding mechanisms, and public-private partnerships can amplify and can replicate the successful strides implemented in some local and state educational systems today. These are examples like the Arizona governor's proposal to invest in summer learning, longer school days, and tutoring to help students recover lost learning due to COVID, or local initiatives in cities across the United States, as well as proposed national legislation that examines best practices to address the school to prison pipeline by prioritizing funding for holistic mental health supports for students, rather than just increasing law enforcement in schools. Take, for example, the Federal Counseling, Not Criminalization in Schools Act, which would establish a $2.5 billion grant program to replace law enforcement in schools with mental health services to prevent tragic experiences like that of Kaya Roll in Orlando. Or expanding funding that helps to support distance learning to close the digital divide. Or states that deployed funds in partnership with network providers to increase broadband access to and to secure laptops and iPads for all students. From a legal perspective, these levers for change may have the greatest impact if the federal, legislative, and executive branches take a greater role in supporting state efforts to guarantee educational adequacy, as well as ensuring equitable funding for schools to pay for support services for students in districts that have the greatest needs. In addition, the United States Department of Education plays a critical role in information gathering and in data dissemination, as we see with the Civil Rights Data Collection Project. They may serve as a national repository for the guidance learned from existing best practices of successful educational initiatives all over the country. As the Supreme Court noted in 1923 in the Meyer versus Nebraska case, American people have always regarded education and the acquisition of knowledge as matters of supreme importance. And as Supreme Court Justice William Brennan opined in Plyler versus Doe, education has a fundamental role in maintaining the fabric of our society. We cannot ignore the significant costs borne by our nation when select groups are denied the means to absorb the values and the skills upon which our social order rests. In this remarkable moment that includes a global health crisis, heightened attentions to issues of racial injustice, and greater awareness of educational inequality as a result of the pandemic, still, we are not saved. The path may not be linear, but there are avenues for progress and examples of success. With courageous certainty, we may find compassion, we may find hope, justice, and mercy to move forward collectively. Out of pandemic education, there are opportunities in the American social, political, and legal landscape to create more equitable education policies that support all children. After all, education is the equality enforcer. It's the democracy driver, and it's the ultimate domain for reconciliation. So I thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I will close out my PowerPoint with one last slide, which is a picture from many moons ago of Dean Derrick Bell when we had dinner together when I was a law student at Stanford and he had come to visit. So I felt it was fitting to end the lecture with another picture of him. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions and answers. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Professor Epperson, for that really challenging and inspiring lecture. And I am going to moderate our question and answer period. We have about 30 minutes. And while people want to invite the audience to type their questions into the Q&A as opposed to the chat, into the Q&A function, and I'll be able to read those and provide those to Professor Epperson. But while you're getting those questions together, I wanted to take the moderator's privilege to ask some of my own questions first. Sure. So one of them is, right from the very beginning, and in fact, one of our audience members was very interested in getting that graph that you showed us about segregation in schools today, right? And so I grew up in North Carolina, and in the first grade, I was in the Raleigh City Schools. In the second grade, we became a unified school system. And so I was in the Wake County Public Schools. And my schools were fairly well integrated, right? And so it's surprising, I knew this fact that most children are not in integrated schools. So I'm wondering, is it the case that there was progress and then we backtracked? Or was it always a case of that Brown didn't have that intended effect?
That is a great question, because it is really it's not really widely understood, the data on desegregation. And so what's interesting is there are both geographic differences, and then of course there are differences in the timing. So in the period immediately after the Supreme Court decision, which was 1954, for about 10 years, there was almost no movement in Southern schools. So public schools in the Deep South remained about 98% segregated, racially segregated. And there were a couple of factors that turned the tide. One was the passage of civil rights legislation. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act included a couple of provisions, Title IV and Title VI, which really kind of put teeth into the meaning of desegregation and provided sort of both carrots and sticks around school desegregation. But in addition to that, some people have heard of the famous line from what we call Brown v. Board of Education 2, which is the 1955 Supreme Court decision that really detailed the remedy. The 54 decision said state mandated racial segregation in schools is unconstitutional. The 55 decision said we must desegregate with all deliberate speed. But what that meant was it offered very little teeth to districts that were, even if they wanted to, they didn't really have a roadmap in terms of what to do. And inertia meant that through something called freedom of choice plans, most school districts just did nothing. With a series of Supreme Court decisions, Green and Swan being in North Carolina, in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, actually, they laid out some of the parameters of school desegregation, that schools had an affirmative duty to remove the vestiges of desegregation root and branch. The Green decision provided about 6 different factors that schools could look to. I mean, practically speaking, what does the student population look like? What does the teacher population look like? How are the extracurriculars? Those kinds of things. And so interestingly, it is actually, Dean Burke, in places like where you grew up that we saw the biggest rise and change because they were required to change. When I mentioned that there were a series of cases that allowed for less movement in the northern, western parts of the United States, it's because there's also a famous Supreme Court case, Milliken versus Bradley, and I quoted Justice Marshall's dissenting opinion in Milliken, but it was about the desegregation of Detroit schools. And in Detroit, essentially what the Supreme Court said was you could not mandate a desegregation remedy that would tie cities to suburbs if there had not been a finding of state mandated racial segregation in each of those districts. So it essentially allowed for what we think of as white flight, where you had in major cities, often whiter, wealthier neighborhoods in a suburban ring outside of an inner city that might have had a higher percentage of students of color and also a lower socioeconomic status for families there. And so that allowed that kind of segregation through white flight and those changing demographic patterns to flourish throughout the North, in the West, in the Southwest, and yet school districts like yours that were required to desegregate by court order, this is where, you know, the work of the lawyers of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the Educational Opportunities Section, and lawyers like myself at LDF there were these consent decrees and there was oversight of that desegregation for quite some time. And I think one of the interesting things about that is that you see tremendous change then in Southern districts, and you had places like the most recent Supreme Court case around voluntary integration, which is dealt with two areas, Seattle and also with Jefferson County, Kentucky, which is where Louisville is. It's a school district that was under a consent decree to desegregate, and they did so sort of kicking and screaming. But after having to do this for a period of time and trying to thoughtfully come up with ways to racially integrate schools, they were one of the greatest success stories and chose to voluntarily continue programs of integration because they saw all of the benefits of it. And they tried to, in recent years, while it's not mandated, it will be an example of a place that has voluntary integration by using things like school choice programs and magnet programs, because they saw documented benefits, as we have seen, around promoting tolerance and developing cross-cultural understanding and improving academic achievement and critical thinking skills, all the things that we now have as well-documented benefits of that desegregation. So that's why you see differences around the country. And then the last thing I would say is in the 90s, there were a series of Supreme Court opinions that made it much easier for school districts that had been under consent decree to be out of the consent decrees. And so we also saw resegregation in many of those districts when you couple the removal of those policies or those decrees with intractable housing segregation. So if the neighborhoods are segregated and there's nothing to mandate crossing a border from one neighborhood to another, you often are going to have segregated schools.
Thank you. And I was glad you mentioned the magnet schools and charter schools and all of those different mechanisms, because I think Professor Kimberly West Falcon, who is a classmate of mine in law school, wrote about that for her law school note, right? Because that was one of the tactics also developed to deal with white flight. So while we're under this decree, people were leaving, but to say that there was value in staying in the public school, that was one of the tools that we implemented. And that has its own implications, right, for education and having schools within schools oftentimes. So it's not truly integrated. But we've got some great questions coming through from the audience. And one is for you to comment more about the federal government's role in education, right? And we've seen, that states and local governments are drivers in public education and often oppose federal involvement. And so what role can and should the federal government play? And then I think that, the questioner is asking also, as we go from administration to administration, we can see radically different approaches.
Absolutely. I mean, I think just giving my example of the guidance that was provided in 2014, that was then rescinded in 2018 under a different administration, we absolutely do see changes. And so on the one hand, do I think executive action in the way that I mentioned is always going to be the best solution? Not necessarily, but it has been a very good one. And so when speaking of the broader role of federal involvement in education, the reality is that most of what happens in education does happen, particularly with respect to funding, at the state level. And this is the model that we have in part because of what I mentioned, that we have no explicit right to education in the United States Constitution. The Supreme Court has not recognized it as a fundamental right. And so in refusing to recognize it as a fundamental right in the early 1970s, they then sort of kicked the can down the road and it is left to state and local governments. Now, I think in many ways, that is a wonderful thing because you are being educated at the local level and local communities may have a greater idea of what schools need and how to fashion educational programs in a particular area. The difficulty with that is we are now at a point where we have such varying degrees of the levels of education and educational opportunities from district to district and from state to state that I think the time is right for re-evaluating the ways in which existing legislation might be helpful to spur a higher floor, if you will, for what the minimum each state provides to every kid is. And so that's kind of what I am suggesting. It's not unheard of to have this level of federal involvement in education because, as I mentioned, we have a host of pieces of federal legislation, longstanding legislation that affects education. And we really do have this long history of executive involvement in enforcing equality. So while the biggest pots of money, and one could say the biggest levers, are in state and local areas, I think that it is important for us to look at the ways, honestly, to look at the ways the feds should step up and help, that this is not something that states should have to bear the burden for all on their own. And it is true that from administration to administration, in terms of our executive, we might have significant differences. But I also think it's true that we have legislation that, regardless of the administration, has stayed. So, for example, when I mention ESEA, which is now the Every Student Succeeds Act, I mean, that is a longstanding piece of federal education legislation. So I think there are ways to almost kind of through the back door, if you will, try to create some standards that can be as helpful as possible to states and to local education agencies who want to do the best things for the kids in their areas.
Thank you. Our next question asks about equal protection and the 14th Amendment. And this person says they studied con law with Dean Bell at the University of Oregon. And their recollection was that he lectured vigorously for belief and enforcement of equal protection doctrines relative to the 14th Amendment. And that was back in 1985. And so the question is, what is the status today of equal protection relative to diversity in American schools?
So that's a big question. Let's see how to distill into a few words the status of equal protection. And well, I guess I would say, since Dean Bell taught constitutional law, I mean, the short answer is I still very much believe in the power of the Equal Protection Clause. Just yesterday, I was teaching it to my 80 students in my constitutional law class about the power of what we call the civil rights enforcement power, which is the power of Congress to create legislation via a piece of the 14th Amendment to really enforce equality. So on a personal level, I believe very much in the strength of the Equal Protection Clause as a space for enforcing equality. If you were to ask, though, how has this, in looking at the Supreme Court, how has the court viewed and interpreted legislation and programs and policies that are either challenged under the Equal Protection Clause or supported? We've had an interesting change over the years. So historically, the Equal Protection Clause was designed to root out racially discriminatory policies, right? So we have this history of something like Brown saying racially segregated education is antithetical to the Constitution and to the Equal Protection Clause. In more recent years, we have seen a kind of flipping of the use of the Equal Protection Clause in higher education. We've seen a number of challenges to affirmative action policies on the basis that they violate the Equal Protection Clause. So a notion that colleges and universities in admissions processes where an admissions office may consider race as one of several factors among students who are applying to a college or university, there have been challenges to suggest that that is unconstitutional. They have failed, and so the Supreme Court has reiterated in several opinions, from the Bakke decision to the Michigan cases, which I wrote one of those briefs to the Supreme Court, so that's back when I was at LDF, to the University of Texas cases, that the Equal Protection Clause does not prohibit the use of affirmative action policies in colleges and universities. And in fact, the court has reiterated the importance of diversity in education spaces and the need for trying to create more racially diverse spaces. So I do believe that it remains robust in that way. And I mentioned the most recent voluntary integration case with respect to K-12 education in the Supreme Court, which was parents involved in community schools versus Seattle School District, which also included the Louisville case I mentioned. And again, in that opinion, you did have 5 justices who, although those particular voluntary integration policies didn't survive, the court reiterated that it is constitutional to have them. They had issues with the particular ones at hand. And you had a majority of justices talk about the importance of eliminating, to the extent possible, racial isolation in public schools and what the harm of that is. So in that opinion, you had 5 justices that really talked about addressing and eliminating racial isolation in public schools as being what could be considered a compelling government interest. So something that was very, very important for the court to address. And I guess the last thing I'd say is it was a different court. So we've had some changes to the lineup since then. And I'm not sure what that will, what that suggests the future will look like, but that is what we had when that decision came down.
Thank you. So let's go from, we're at the federal level and thinking about the Supreme Court. And you mentioned in your talk and discussed Milliken v. Bradley, right? And we think about the fact that it didn't find state action as a cause of segregation in that case, and how it relates to our residential segregation, right? So that, recognizing that we're zoned our schools based on where we live oftentimes. And so in North Carolina, for example, that the answer was busing, right? So I passed a number of neighborhood schools to go to a school far outside of my neighborhood in order to integrate that school. And so we've got a couple of questions, or people are asking about, do we need to do something about our residential zoning, or how we can promote integration within our residential areas to deal with the inequality and lack of diversity in our public schools?
Well, absolutely. They go hand in hand, right? So it's unmistakable and undeniable that sort of as housing policy goes, so goes education in our public schools. So if we, when we have intractable housing segregation, it makes it very difficult or certainly a lot more challenging to find ways to address racial isolation in public schools. So although I'm not the housing law expert, I mean, actually, that might be President Schill on this one. Maybe he can pop in for that one. But it is true that residential zoning laws do have an impact on the composition of schools. So when you're thinking of things like, certain locales that will do things like mandating some level of economic integration in the production of new housing, where you say an X percentage of new housing has to be affordable. Those kinds of things have been shown to have an impact. And then in addition to that, I would say there are creative ways to address in certain jurisdictions the reality of continued residential segregation. Sometimes even if you're thinking very simply of like, how you create attendance zone lines. And so to put it simply, this is, it's unlikely that places look like this, but just as a very simple example, if you had a square district and the northern half happened to be all white and the southern half happened to be all black, well, don't draw the line across the district to make the two high schools. The line should not be that way. And if you do it the other way, then you get the diversity. So I think part of it is thinking about how attendance zone lines are drawn. Part of it is also dealing, as I mentioned, capitalizing on changing demographic patterns. We have a lot of sort of, for better or worse, with urban renewal, gentrification, a lot of people moving into places that are more accessible and walkable and closer to services and having an interest in being in cities. And there are ways that can also change the landscape of school populations, as well as when I was mentioning the kinds of school choice programs that have been successful. There are things like what I mentioned in Louisville, Kentucky, or even a longstanding one in Hartford, Connecticut, where it's a school district where they had a sort of, since this is litigation that dates back to the 90s, but they have sort of an open choice program. And the idea was to create different types of educational innovations that would be of interest to people from all over. And so it could be people from whiter, wealthier neighborhoods who are very interested in going right into the heart of Hartford, because that's where they get the best early childhood Montessori educational experience for their kids. And that was an example where they also partnered with the Chamber of Commerce, because if you can bring in more families into the city, you're actually can boost the economy of the city as well. So I think also thinking about ways to create partnerships and alliances like that can be very helpful.
So you just answered sort of the next question. In the end of that was thinking about how can parents and educators and teachers unions really come together, because we've known about these inequalities. We've known for a long time, and even though they've been laid bare, as we said, by the pandemic, what can these groups do together to sort of build better coalitions to change the situation?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. I mentioned a little bit there, the idea that the coalitions that are necessary around education, as some of the questions suggest, it's really not just about the schools. It kind of holistically affects the entire community. And I think to the extent that people are building those partnerships and those alliances, that where it's not just about the parents who have kids in the school. It's about, again, what these partnerships mean for the Chamber of Commerce in a city, what it's doing to boost the economy of an area. What are the ways in which innovative housing policies also help bring people into certain areas? Because, there are also ways that if you have a great, as I just mentioned, the kind of Montessori education program for early childhood ed, it can also be a draw for the types of people who might want to live in new housing in certain areas. So I think there are kind of opportunities for local partnerships in that way. There are opportunities at a broader level for partnerships between state education and public-private partnerships. And so we're seeing a lot more of things like that now with the coronavirus pandemic around increasing access to digital learning. And so those are spaces where suddenly you see school districts partnering with AT&T and Verizon and Comcast to get broadband access to kids who previously had no access to the internet and therefore were shut out of schooling. And if we can do it in the middle of a pandemic, we can do it all the time. I mean, this is something that doesn't need to be the Band-Aid that we are doing in the middle of this crisis. It's something that we can see as a long-term solution for kids in many different parts of the country. My talk focused on a particular group of vulnerable students, but you can think about the things that this means for students in rural populations as well, because these are areas that were profoundly impacted with the move to remote learning.
Let's think about, this is Black History Month, right? And so we generally have the Derrick Bell Lecture during this month. And so could you think about, as you said, we need to reckon with our national history as we move forward. And so could you elaborate on what you think the role of education is in sort of addressing our historical narratives, particularly in attempts to sort of erase Black history or undermine the value indeed of Dean Bell's critical race theory and the work that he did?
Sure. Well, I mean, that is something that has been in the news of late, and certainly we saw heightened tensions around this in the last few months, because in the prior presidential administration, there was really an attack on what is the teaching of Dean Derrick Bell and so many other trailblazing legal scholars, and a push to forbid or prohibit the discussion of issues of racial bias or a history of racial discrimination in the United States. And I have lots of thoughts about it. To be perfectly honest, I feel like I could have given another lecture on this. I'm very interested in this other piece of it, because in addition to teaching constitutional law, I also teach critical race theory. I guess I would say we are at a particularly profound moment where the importance of this education is sort of, I think, stronger than it has ever been. I think that despite the fact that there have been calls to, as you said, erase this history, as I said before, I think the path forward does not require unanimity. It just requires enough people to see the harm and to see the damage. And so I am heartened by the fact that, the 1619 project that the New York Times put out won a Pulitzer, and this was a multifaceted education campaign to examine the centrality of slavery and racism in American history. And it was newspapers and magazines and podcasts and a school curriculum that's being adopted all over the country to incorporate lessons about the centrality of racism and slavery in American history. And despite efforts to sort of erase that or counter that, I do think that the prevailing voices, or the stronger voices, are to allow those kinds of, and to encourage and to welcome that kind of education at this particular moment in time. And we saw that in the wake of the summer of protests as well. We have this huge rise. I mean, if you kind of look at the at like the New York Times bestseller list, all summer, every other book was about anti-racist education. And so I think there will always be forces and those who will oppose unmasking this history. I don't think that we're ever going to reach this kumbaya moment where every single person thinks this is what we do. And we don't have to. We just need enough. And I do think right now we are at a point where we are getting more than enough. And that is why I am heartened.
I appreciate you mentioning the 1619 project, because that gives me a chance to plug next week's lecture, which will feature Nicole Hannah Jones.
Fantastic.
Next Friday, 4:30 to 6 p.m. So audience, if you haven't registered, you should register for that as well. I'm gonna maybe ask you one last question. And again, I'll take moderator's prerogative here and let it be my question. And that is, as we, you talked about, how our education is failing our students in many ways in the pandemic, right? It's failing many students. And as I think about what those students will be like when they get to the university, right? And what their needs will be. And I've been thinking a lot about, not thinking about the students as deficient, but recognizing that their education has been deficient. It's not the student, it's the education. And so do you have thoughts about what universities should be doing to be student ready, to be ready to receive these students who may, for the last year and a half, or maybe 2 years by the time it's all said and done, have been in this less than optimal learning environment?
Yeah, you mean as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the virus? Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a number of ways in which we as universities and institutions have to be student ready, and it will take some time. I think that, to be honest, where my mind and honestly my heart goes most is the fact that we have not yet reckoned with, and we will have to for some time, I think, the long-term psychological and mental health effects of this long-term isolation for our students. And so early research is showing that this is a huge problem. It is a huge problem, for every population of every age. But I think for students entering colleges and universities after having been in a lockdown that spans longer than a year, it takes a tremendous toll on their mental health. And I think, as I mentioned when I provided the information about racial disparities in the use of police in schools and the school to prison pipeline, and also this disparity in mental health supports, this is an area where K-12 education and higher education, I think, really have an opportunity for growth. And I do think because of the pandemic, there is more attention being focused on this. But I think for colleges and universities, there are going to be ways that for these kids, like for all of us, we're having to kind of get over this moment of isolation. And for young people in particularly vulnerable times of rapid development, I think this is an area where one of the places for increased attention and growth at colleges and universities is going to have to be around ensuring that there are sort of holistic support services that kind of reckon with what it means for kids to come to college after having been so isolated for so long.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Professor Epperson. We are so thrilled to have you as our Derrick Bell Lecturer this year. And of course, we had hoped to welcome you in person to Eugene. And so I know that you have this other lecture in you about critical race theory. And so we will have to find another opportunity for you to actually come physically to Eugene.
I would love to. Thank you so very much, Dean Burke. Thank you so much for having me.
So again, I want to say thank you to President Schill and to the Division of Equity and Inclusion, and to all of us here at the University of Oregon. I want to say thank you to all of you who attended, and thank you to Professor Epperson.
Thank you.